to explore the life and prophecies of the prophet Malachi, one of the most enigmatic and powerful characters in the Old Testament. Malachi, the last prophet before the silence that preceded the arrival of Christ, faced a time of deep spiritual and social crisis. His mission was clear: to correct the deviations of the people of Israel, from the corruption of the priests to marriages with foreign women, and to call them back to purity and fidelity to God. Have you ever wondered how to keep the faith in times of disillusionment? Or how to find hope and renewal when all seems lost? Malachi offers powerful answers to these questions, bringing messages of correction, repentance, and, above all, hope. He reminds us that even in the darkest moments, God is present, offering forgiveness and promising a future of justice and healing. In this video, we will go through the most important moments in the life of the prophet Malachi: his historical context, his prophetic mission, the rebukes to the priests, the issue of mixed marriages, the promise of the messenger, the invitation to repentance and faithfulness, and finally the day of the Lord and the coming of the righteous one. Join us on this fascinating journey and discover how Malachi's messages continue to resonate today, bringing valuable lessons for our own spiritual lives. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and don't forget to like the video. That way you cooperate directly for more stories like this. That said, let's get to today's video. Let's begin our journey by understanding the historical context in which the prophet Malachi lived. To grasp the importance and relevance of his prophecies, we need to situate ourselves in the time and circumstances in which he emerged. Imagine ancient Jerusalem, a city that had experienced great glories and terrible tragedies. About 100 years before Malachi, the Jews had returned from exile in Babylon. This exile had been a period of great suffering and reflection for the people of Israel, who saw their holy city, Jerusalem, and its magnificent temple destroyed. When they finally returned to their land, they were filled with hope and determination to rebuild the temple and restore their nation. With great effort and dedication, they managed to rebuild the temple under the leadership of figures like Zerubbabel and Ezra. However, after the completion of this grand work, the initial enthusiasm began to wane. The people, who had once been fervent in their devotion and eager to follow God's commandments, began to fall into spiritual apathy. Daily life became more difficult, and many began to wonder where the promised prosperity and blessing they expected after the reconstruction were. It was in this environment of disillusionment and discouragement that Malachi appeared. He emerged at a time when problems were deep and complex. The faith of the people was weakened. Religious practices, which should have been sacred and respected, had become routine and often dishonored. The priests, who were supposed to lead the people spiritually, were making serious mistakes, offering inadequate sacrifices and disrespecting God's altar. Additionally, the people of Israel were facing social and moral problems. Marriages with foreigners were becoming common, something that threatened the purity of the Jewish faith and culture. There was also growing social injustice, where the poor and vulnerable were often neglected and mistreated. Malachi was called by God to be the voice that would bring correction and hope. He was not an ordinary prophet. His mission was to confront directly the errors and divert the people from the path of corruption and indifference. With strong and clear words, Malachi began to challenge the status quo, calling for a return to true worship and faithfulness to God. Malachi, whose name means "my messenger," brought a message that was both of rebuke and hope. He highlighted the need for purity and devotion, criticizing the priests for their negligence and the people for their unfaithfulness. But above all, he brought a promise of redemption, prophesying the coming of a messenger who would prepare the way for the Lord, a foreshadowing of the arrival of John the Baptist and ultimately Jesus Christ. This historical context is essential to understand the depth and urgency of Malachi's messages. He not only spoke of spiritual problems, but also touched on social and moral issues, calling the people to a complete and sincere return to God. Malachi's story shows us that, even in times of disillusionment and apathy, God's voice continues to call, offering correction and hope to all who are willing to listen and follow. Malachi was not an ordinary prophet. He was called to confront directly the issues of his time: corruption among the priests, intermarriages with foreigners, and a people who had lost their faith. His mission was clear: to confront and correct these deviations, calling everyone back to the purity of worshiping God. Malachi began his mission with courage and determination. He knew that the work ahead would not be easy, but his conviction and faith in God propelled him forward. The corruption among the priests was one of the greatest challenges. They were supposed to be spiritual leaders, models of behavior and faithfulness to God. However, they were committing grave transgressions. They offered imperfect sacrifices, sick or defective animals, something expressly forbidden by God's law. Malachi was direct in his accusations, calling attention to the seriousness of their actions and the lack of respect for God's altar. In his words, Malachi did not spare criticism. He accused the priests of despising God's name, profaning the altar, and treating with disdain the sacrifices that should have been offered with purity and devotion. His words were harsh but necessary. He sought to awaken the priests to the importance of their role and the responsibility they had before God and the people. In addition to the corruption of the priests, Malachi also faced the challenge of intermarriages with foreigners. Many Israelites were marrying women from other nations who followed different gods. This practice threatened the purity of the Jewish faith and identity. Malachi urged the people to maintain the purity of their faith and not to stray into other religions. He emphasized the importance of faithfulness both in human relationships and in the covenant with God. Malachi knew that spiritual infidelity had grave consequences. He compared the relationship between God and Israel to a marriage, where the infidelity of one partner causes pain and separation. His message was clear: faithfulness to God was essential for the prosperity and blessing of the people. Malachi called the Israelites to return to God with all their heart, to restore their devotion, and to live according to God's commandments. Besides spiritual and moral issues, Malachi also addressed social problems. He denounced the injustice and oppression of the poor and vulnerable. Malachi called for justice, reminding the people